Xenoblade. Look, if you're here, you probably know me as a Phantasy Star Online channel, so you know I enjoy a mix of sci-fi and fantasy. I also rather like Star Ocean, though I only played one game in that franchise. Regardless, Xenoblade Chronicles always struck me as a game that would scratch a similar itch. And, well, I knew on some level that I would enjoy it. After all, I have had the original Xenoblade Chronicles since it was new. But I never beat it, and that kept me from getting further into the series. Not for lack of trying, mind you. The first time I played Xenoblade Chronicles 1, I mostly got burnt out thanks to the side quests. It's really easy to get bogged down in them. If you don't do them, it'll feel like you're mostly ignoring the rest of the game. But if you do them, you'll end up quite over-leveled, and that can really suck a lot of the challenge and fun out of the game. Thankfully, this is something that Definitive Edition would address, but this is how my first attempt ended. As for my second time through, well, a lot of stuff got in the way. Mostly I had to pause my playthrough because I was moving, and I'm pretty sure this all happened in summer 2019. So a few months later, the Definitive Edition got announced, and I decided against picking my playthrough back up, figuring that sometime down the road I'd start again on the Definitive Edition this time. But that would take a few more years, and not until after something else. I was preparing for the Wii U and 3DS eShop closures, so I was grabbing basically whatever I could off there, and I decided to include Xenoblade X in that, since prior to the announcement of the Definitive Edition, it was one of the last great games stuck in Wii U purgatory, and then when the online service was getting closed, I decided to play through it because it does have some online features. And it became the first game in the series that I beat. I'm sure there must be some reason for it beyond just the time pressure, but I can't think of anything, can you? But then after beating Xenoblade X, well, it's only natural that would make me interested in playing the rest, right? I beat Xenoblade 1 and the bonus content from the Definitive Edition in late 2024, and then in the past couple of months I played through Xenoblade 2 and its DLC. So what about X makes it so special? It's the topic of this video after all. Even if this isn't a proper review or retrospective, more of a hey, here's a neat thing kind of video so that people buy the Definitive Edition. And, you know, to highlight that Xenoblade X is a pretty good way to get hooked on the franchise. Well, Xenoblade X takes the single-player MMO style of design that Xenoblade 1 had in its gameplay and quests, and runs with it. Keeps the general combat system that feels a lot like the tab target MMOs of the era, and a lot of the changes to the game's formula make it feel even more like an MMO, right down to the sprawling and open layout of the hub city, which genuinely makes me wonder if maybe it was meant as an MMO at one point in development. But while there is some online functionality, it's far from an MMO, being mostly asynchronous stuff with the option to do a small selection of instance content in co-op. Definitely further from an MMO than even a lobby-based game like Phantasy Star or Monster Hunter. Closest comparison I can think of is Dark Souls, simply because, well, that's the franchise that you think of when it comes to asynchronous multiplayer aspects. I tend to not like to bury the lead unless I have a very good reason, so let's start with the thing that I think makes Xenoblade X most unique, both among its franchise and among RPGs in general, and that's its open world, which I think is better than, frankly, most open world games I've played, RPG or not. This kind of open world is not really a thing commonly associated with the Japanese side of RPGs, but despite that, Monolith Soft nailed it here. Or maybe they nailed it because it's not commonly a thing in Japanese RPGs. I do often tend to dislike more standardized approaches to game design. There's probably a good ramble in here, or perhaps an entire video, but another time. Frankly, I think that Xenoblade X is up there with Elden Ring and Tears of the Kingdom. The open world feels alive and properly non-linear. A little barren, perhaps, but that kind of thing is justified when everyone on this planet basically just got here after a crash landing. I just think it would be nice if there were more settlements and such. Honestly, I feel like this would have been a better game for PSO2 New Genesis to steal from rather than Breath of the Wild when it was designing its open world. Maybe it's just the fact that my preferred weapon type was photon sabers, but when I was first playing through this game, I found myself thinking a lot about how this makes me feel like I'm playing an open-world Phantasy Star Online game, even though one of those already exists. But the open world here is vast, surprisingly so. There's only 5 zones, not counting the city, but each one is larger than anything in Xenoblade 1 or 2. Plus, it's all totally seamless, letting you cross from zone to zone, traveling from one side of the world to the other without a loading screen or anything else, unless you fast travel. But equally important, it's not empty. Every hex on the map has something for you to find or do to be marked complete. A treasure to find, a probe to set, an optional boss to fight, all spaced out just about perfectly. And it's not all neatly sorted into a perfectly smooth level progression. It's easy to walk a short ways off the path and find enemies much tougher than what you were just fighting, as is often the case in the Xenoblade series, really. And I think this fits great in this more open world. Not only does it make the game feel more natural and less artificial, but it adds to the exploration. The majority of roadblocks in this game are simply enemies that are too high level for you to fight, at least when you first encounter them. And so leveling up isn't just about numbers getting bigger, but rather getting stronger so that you can go to new places. I find that sometimes the convenience of a level curve that's too well balanced makes leveling up itself redundant in some games, but Xenoblade X's approach is nice. It's not just a bigger number, it's, oh hey, now that I'm this level, maybe I can beat those enemies and access something new. Aside from leveling up, the only thing that really exists to limit your ability to explore the world without it are the mechs known as skells. These do a lot to speed up and open up exploration, both when you get your first skell and when you later get the flight module. And on top of this, it also ties back into unlocking new areas simply by getting stronger, because the cool robots are significantly stronger than a human on foot, as they should be. A level 30 skell, which you'll use for most of the game, can bite most things until the post-game, so once you get your skell, the world is yours to explore. So not only are the skells cool because, well, they're mechs, but it's a great and organic way to help open up the world to the player. And this kind of makes it one of my favorite video game mechs. Plus, I always think mechs feel incredible in a game that also lets you play on foot, because this allows you to appreciate the scale of these mechs, both in terms of their size and their power, and that absolutely is the case here. And all this matters because the quality of the open world is integral to the quality of this game. Because, to be honest, exploration and side quests feel way more important than the main storyline, and they're executed quite well here. Minor side quests are streamlined, with things like collection quests easily just grabbed from the quest board in town, and those still autocomplete when done. No need to seek out the person and click through 4 different quest accept dialogues, like in the first game. While not the most exciting quests, these minor quests are an extra thing to do to get you out there and exploring and looking for all those things hidden in the open world, and to give you a little push to explore one place over another. Help prevent that sort of decision paralysis. So these help motivate you to spend a bit of time just exploring. It's one of my favorite parts of the game, and it turns grinding into just a natural part of the exploration you were going to do anyway. Meanwhile, the more important side stories have all the same presentation as main story chapters, with voice-acted cutscenes and the like. Right down to being treated as main story quests. You can only have a single one at a time. It gives the game a sort of episodic TV series vibe, with multiple storylines you can explore in the order you prefer, with each chapter of the story having a clear start and end point. In fact, many main story missions will require you to explore some of the side content before you start them, further pushing the episodic approach. Really, I feel like this might be the best way to do an open world game that still has a decent focus on story, pushing the side quests and going for an episodic feel. Maybe not quite as elegant as a Breath of the Wild style game that is entirely built around the freedom of an open world, but a good bit better than most open world games where freedom evaporates when you do a story mission. So the open world is a highlight, and something about it just feels even more MMO-like than the other Xenoblade games. Maybe just down to being much larger and interconnected, compared to the other Xenoblade games being a bit more linear. Honestly, I can't think of a Japanese RPG that does its open world better than this. What about customization and character systems, since those are always some of the defining traits of RPGs? Well, to start with, unlike the rest of the series, Xenoblade X stars a fully custom protagonist who you're locked into controlling. There is a class tree system, but it's highly customizable. There are 6 different branches you can go down, each with an associated melee and ranged weapon. Active arts are all linked to a certain weapon type, but if you master a branch, you unlock the ability to equip that branch's weapons on any class, letting you basically make your own custom class with your choice of weapons and associated arts. Then there's also passive skills, which can be assigned to any class as soon as you get them. And on the topic of the protagonist, it also introduced to the series the cosmetic armor slots to let you customize your appearance. Very much appreciated, especially for your custom character. But it's not just your character alone. You have a large number of NPCs you can pick from to compose your party. Most of them aren't related to the main story, instead having their own episodic side stories and their own character arcs, not really connected to the main storyline, feeding into that episodic feel. In combat, they have their own customized versions of classes available to you, typically with one weapon from a different branch and a unique art the player can only learn from them. So basically they have their own unique build within the same class system you get to build with, which is nice for tying everything together. The player still gets to pick the companion's arts and skills though, so there is some customization, and only one character gets access to the highest tier of classes besides you, so you're still definitely unique. You can also temporarily recruit NPC versions of other players. You can't customize them, but it is cool, and you even get a small reward for when your NPC helps out another player. And it adds to the fake MMO vibe the game has, having other people in your party, even if it's just effectively a ghost of them. And there's usually one empty slot in your party for story missions, so the game is pretty good about letting you take along your favorite. Though aside from the nice introduction of cosmetic slots, gear is pretty bland. It's very fiddly, with abilities that have too many levels, splitting their effects into too small of increments, and often the effects are way too niche. Sometimes you can get really good rare gear, but for the most part you're collecting a lot of junk to sort through. I never really got the sense there was much potential to do anything interesting with the gear. Even if there is, the sheer amount of randomness in what drops holds it back. As does the fact that it's very easy to get to a point where most of what you find will be trash, especially if you end up a little over-leveled and just buy gear from the shop. And lastly, there's the matter of equipping your Skell mech. Notably, they're all armed to the teeth. While on foot you can have 2 weapons at a time, each with a number of skills, a Skell can have as many as 10 weapons at once, 8 of these providing a single skill that is the weapon's use, and 2 of them providing your auto attacks. As someone who loves mechs bristling with weapons, yeah, this system for defining your mech through its arsenal is great. You can paint it too, of course, as is the case in any good game with custom mechs, and even name your mech. You're also fully in charge of outfitting your party with mechs, so you have a bit more control over them in this area. I love a good equipment-focused customization system for a video game mech. But while the character systems aren't the most captivating I've seen, they're good enough and give you significant freedom to shape your avatar. While characters could be more sharply differentiated, this may also be a concession to the multiplayer and the inherent uncertainty that the player can be any class, just to ensure that it's harder for a bad team composition to screw things over. And there are a few other things I want to talk about. For one, in addition to the gear stuff, there's a fair few other systems that are just fiddly and overwhelming, like the soul voice system that causes a character's combat barks to also provide buffs to their allies and direct NPCs. Or, once again, the gear and all the systems surrounding it, such as slots and crafting. Mostly the kind of systems that are just a bit overwhelming, add a lot of fiddling with things that don't feel rewarding, and many of which are not well explained. Meanwhile, the game's combat is in a little bit of an odd place. It's sort of all the elements of Xenoblade 1 that Xenoblade 2 didn't continue on with. It lacks the element of chaining actions between party members like the break, topple, daze chains in the first game or the blade and driver combos of the sequel. Party-wide chain attacks are replaced with the single character attack spam that is overdrive, and there's generally less emphasis on coordination between party members. Instead, the emphasis is on the more mechanically dense arts that Xenoblade 2 largely moved away from. Combat does feel a little less reactive as a result, but I do still enjoy it and there's enough depth to craft a strategy here. Also, the setting is just not quite as compelling as the other Xenoblade titles I've played. There's some really great stuff in here, don't get me wrong, like how the Earth is effectively collateral damage in a galactic gang war. That's some borderline cosmic horror shit right there. Plus there's some interesting reveals throughout the story, but I don't know, it just doesn't draw me in as much as the worlds of the other Xenoblade games. Though maybe that's a bit of an unfair comparison. I did really enjoy Xenoblade X's world when I played through it. It just so happens that the rest of the series has some of the most interesting and compelling worlds I've seen in a video game. So yeah, maybe it's fine actually. So I guess what I'm getting here is that it's mostly the open world and ability to create your own character that carry Xenoblade X. The other systems are mostly fine, but not quite up to the level of other games in the series or otherwise particularly special. Fortunately, that open world is damn special. I should include some stuff on the Definitive Edition changes, huh? I wasn't originally planning on it, but when I actually played through the game, there's enough here that I should probably mention it. Mostly quality of life and presentation improvements. The menus are much quicker and better looking. It's great to have all the info in an in-game library instead of the Wii U digital manual. And there's an autosave. Thank God. They haven't exactly been common in this series. In 1, 2, and my original playthrough of X, each of those games I had at least one time where a game crash or freeze caused me to lose an hour or two of progress. In the case of X, that happened to me during a particularly painful quest, too. Oh, and they also added the ability to swap out party members from anywhere instead of having to search for them in town. And the map is also way more helpful. It's much easier to find heart-to-heart scenes, which I largely missed in my original playthrough. And it also gives you some guidance as to where to find objectives for minor quests, which is a huge help. You can even set the game to track required materials for craftable items, and it will include map markers for those too. Then there's some small combat tweaks, most notably the addition of the quick cooldown system, which I really like. It adds an extra resource to manage while speeding up the gameplay, and it's especially nice when dealing with weak enemies that you can slaughter in a single alpha strike of your skill bar. I really appreciate the revised fashion gear system. It works like it does in Xenoblade 1 Definitive Edition. Once you find a piece of gear, it is permanently unlocked as fashion gear for everyone. So no more carrying around a bunch of useless but unique items just in case you want to use them to look pretty down the line. And what few changes for the worse that I can see are mostly very subjective in the realm of maybe they made one or two things a little too convenient, but that's always a very delicate balancing act. Like they removed blade ranks and your field skills effectively start at rank 3. And so right from the start you can perform most interactions that would have required a higher field skill. The only things that are locked off at the start are the ones that required level 4 of the field skill, which is acquired in the same way by completing certain side missions. Or there's the aforementioned map markers, which feel like they can sometimes make the game a little too focused on just following the quest markers rather than exploring for yourself. But keep in mind, most of the time, the original version of the game provided zero guidance beyond the general region your target is in. So unless you took a lot of notes or memorized everything, the worst you could say is probably that this is a bit of an overcorrection, but still probably overall an improvement over the base version of Xenoblade X, where a lot of side missions could just be down to getting lucky finding what you need. Oh, and you do have to play through the game to get to the added content. It makes sense with Xenoblade X's custom protagonist and focus on the open world, but if you've already played the game and were hoping to just jump right into the added content like you could in the definitive edition of the first game, yeah, it's not an option. That said, the new content is sprinkled throughout the game. It's not just new post-game stuff, and there are a couple of new companions added as a result of these quests. Oh, and related to the definitive edition, or rather the new hardware, a small warning. Once you get a scale, do make sure you close the game or turn to the title screen when you stop playing. Yes, it's annoying to load back in rather than just waking the game from sleep mode, but if you just leave it in sleep mode, your scale won't recover fuel. Yeah, this is annoying, and hopefully a patch fixes it, but until then, I just wanted to make that clear. Anyway, back to the stuff I originally wrote and recorded. Yeah, most of this was written from memory of my original playthroughs, so while I have tried to correct changes that I noticed with captions, that's why the audio may have some things that are no longer true in definitive edition. Anyway, back to past me. And hey, while we're here, I'm just gonna talk a little about Xenoblade 1 and 2, because why not? Starting off with Xenoblade 1, the first thing I want to draw attention to here is that of the games I've played thus far, it has my favorite combat system. I like each character having their own unique art list that gives each one just the right mix of unique functions and unique gimmicks, and leaving just the right amount of room for customization. Talent arts help further define the characters, giving them a unique signature move or defining mechanic that weaves through all of their arts, and I just really like Xenoblade 1's chain attacks, more than the overdrive of Xenoblade X or Xenoblade 2's take on the chain attack system. I love how it turns this game from a sort of single-player MMO style to a sort of turn-based RPG in which you get all the turns, letting you set up actions and perform combos with impunity. Plus, because of the control it gives you, it was something I used tactically as often as I used it for pure damage. Though on the downside, well, as I sort of alluded to earlier, the pacing isn't great. It's very easy to get bogged down in side quests. There's a few long lulls in the main quest. The game's long enough that burning out towards the end is a real danger. And yet, in spite of all of this, there's some really good hidden content that you can just go the whole game never knowing is even in there, like the fact that each character has 2 extra unlockable skill trees. I didn't get any of them. In the end, I'm not a completionist, but the highest praise I can give to a game is usually that it made me into a completionist. Most often with, like, indie RPGs. Like, I've got 100% completion in Chained Echoes. But Xenoblade didn't quite inspire me to go this far, or maybe it's just a matter of there's more of it than I would be inclined to go for 100% completion on. I don't want to make it sound like I'm complaining that this game has too much stuff to do after all, but it's still got the best combat, and it's very easy to see how this game launched a franchise. As for Xenoblade 2, I rather enjoyed it as well. Like, I get why it's a bit divisive. It is different, but I enjoyed it. I loved the world of Allrest, and while the story is pretty uneven in the early game, towards the end there were several moments I found really emotional. Here I'd say the big issue, especially compared to the first game, is the combat system and how long it takes to get going in particular. It took several chapters before I felt things were exciting, and it feels like the early game is artificially slowed down because having arts start off ready to use rather than on cooldown is an upgrade you have to buy for each character. In 1 and X, all your arts are ready to go at the start of every fight, but not here. Plus, the game is very focused around blade and driver combos, so until you get a good setup to start using those, the combat is pretty shallow. Does at least do a good job of streamlining down the more unwieldy systems though. Gears simplified so that you're no longer messing with a ton of secondary effects. Quests are streamlined to just the ones with more narrative, though some of these can feel a bit padded with fetch quest style objectives. So it's still a good game, and I actually kind of like the blade system. It's just a very different side grade. I mean, I'm a Phantasy Star Online fan, so I like very different side grades, but I understand why some people can be pissed off at them, especially at the time. Though, the expansion is amazing. I love the combat that better emphasizes blades and drivers fighting together. The pacing is immaculate, and everything's just a little bit smoother. Plus the side quests are really fantastic, and I love how they're tied together through interwoven subplots in the community system. Unlike Xenoblade 1, 2, and X, this is a place where I did go for a near completionist run. If this were a standalone game, it might just be one of my favorite RPGs, period. If you already own Xenoblade 2, the $30 DLC pack is worth it just for this. I just wish it was a $30 standalone so it would be easier to recommend to people. And the ending is phenomenal. Once again, I gave this what I consider to be the highest praise I can give a game. I went for 100% on it, and got pretty close. Lastly, I haven't played Xenoblade 3 yet. Maybe I'll do a short thing about it when I do get around to playing through it. Xenoblade Chronicles X is kinda the unappreciated gem of the series, having been marooned on Wii U, and with the Switch 2 on the horizon, it's probably going to be the very last title to be rescued from Wii U and given a Switch port. And I worry that even with the Switch 2 having backwards compatibility, the late release of this definitive edition might leave it to be overlooked again. And I think that'd be a real shame. It's a very unique and different entry in the series, and I think it's also a surprisingly good way to get hooked on the series. Because it's entirely self-contained, you can play it with no prerequisites and no sense that you need to play the rest. But maybe you will, like I did. Because for me, Xenoblade X was where I got hooked. As I said earlier, I finally beat Xenoblade 1 late last year, then I started Xenoblade 2 in January and have completed it, along with its DLC. So at this point, the only stuff left is the new content that's going to be added to the definitive edition, and Xenoblade 3. Then I'll have finally conquered this white whale of mine. It's funny, I was with the franchise at the start. I still have my physical copy of Xenoblade 1 on the Wii. Then this whole series happened before I ever actually beat any of the games. And now 15 years later, I'm finally playing through this entire franchise in maybe 2 years' time. If there's a regret I have with this, it's that if I had played through the games as they came out, I might have had more time to really get into the side content. I'm certainly leaving more of that on the table than I would have liked. But for years I considered this series the number one on the list of the franchises I wanted to get into someday, but just hadn't gotten around to. And now I'm almost done with it. It feels kind of melancholy in a way. Well, then I'll get into other Monolith soft titles, like Xenosaga. I'll keep busy. Between Xenoblade and Super Robot Wars OG Saga Endless Frontier, I'm kinda hooked on this company now. In fact, it was playing Endless Frontier that made me wanna get back on this series and led to my recent playthroughs of Xenoblade 1 and 2. Funny how that works. Got a video that also covers Endless Frontier if you want to take a look at that. But even outside the context of its series or developer, Xenoblade X is really solid and distinctive. One of the better open-world RPGs I've played, with the emphasis placed firmly on exploration, and arranged such that the RPG systems complement the freedom you're given. And I'm not sure I've played any game that lets you freely explore an open world in a mech like this. And it certainly does the open world better than most RPGs, especially Japanese RPGs. So even if you don't want a gateway drug to the rest of Xenoblade, maybe X will be just the sort of game you fall in love with. And now back over to you. What are your thoughts on Xenoblade X and the series as a whole? Was there anyone else who finally got hooked on the franchise thanks to this particular game? Will you be playing Xenoblade X Definitive Edition now that it's out? Let me know in the comments below, and for now, this is Mikhail, signing off.